Welcome to the Environmental Update. I'm Brian Hoppy, and I serve as Chair of the Lower Merion Environmental Advisory Council, or EAC. With the help of our friends at Lower Merion TV, the EAC created this program to address environmental topics of concern within the township, to provide some helpful hints and other guidance to address environmental issues in our homes or on our properties, and to introduce you to the environmental leaders within our community. We're on location today at the Riverbend Environmental Education Center in Gladwin, and we're here to discuss non-native and invasive plant species and why their removal is important within the township. First, let's get a little background on this from my fellow EAC member, Sara Schuh. Sara?
Thanks, Brian. I'm Sara Pevaroff Schuh. I'm a licensed landscape architect and a member of the Environmental Advisory Council, along with my colleague, Brian. Today we'll be talking about invasive plants. I'm going to talk to you about what they are and why should it matter to you. So an invasive plant is one that has been introduced to our area, whether intentionally or by accident, and is likely to cause environmental or economic damage or harm to human health. Think of it as a bully in the schoolyard of plants. An invasive plant grows aggressively, lacks natural predators, and unfortunately displaces native plants in our native plant communities. Why does this matter to you? If left uncontrolled, it destroys the land use we presently enjoy, it causes damage to our ecosystems, and unfortunately costs our country billions of dollars. They're present in many of our township parks, and they often crowd out our habitat for native pollinators. There's a huge loss to crops and to forestation efforts due to invasive plants. So one of the plants I want to talk to you about today is the chestnut tree. Chestnut tree was destroyed due to the Asian chestnut blight. We've lost almost 200 million trees on the northeast coast due to it, and Brian and Lori are going to talk a little bit more about that when they get to Riverbend. We lost several species of moths and butterflies who could only host on the American chestnut tree. So one of the things you can do is learn how to identify invasive plants. Standing around me here by the train tracks outside the township building are a lot of invasive species. Why? Because this is a disturbed area. Often when the land's been cleared or when it's been left after a storm event or another large climatic event, you see a lot of invasive species crop up. So standing around here, I see Microstegium, which is Japanese stilt grass, highly invasive and one that you're very likely to see in your own backyard. Some other plants that you might see in your own backyard might be garlic mustard. And I'm looking around, I'm not seeing any in immediate, but I do see Canadian thistle here, another common invasive that you might see in your own backyard. Again, why does that matter to you? Do you ever walk in the Wissahickon? Do you walk in Rolling Hill Park? You'll see the proliferation of Norway maples there. It's particularly common that they take over and crowd out our native plants, and often you're left with a monoculture of maples. So you can avoid purchasing native plants. Some of them are still being sold in our nurseries today, such as Norway maples, such as bamboo. There's bamboo behind me on the tracks here, and we'll show you some pictures of that. It's illegal to plant bamboo in the township, and yet it's still being sold in some nurseries. And more importantly, when you see them in your backyard, pulling them up, particularly after a storm like today, it's much easier to pull up a native plant, to pull up an invasive plant. So I'm going to give you an example here. Because the rain has loosened the soil, it makes it very easy to pull up and get the whole root. You definitely don't want to pull it up and leave the root system there. Invasive species thrive after the ground's been disturbed. So if you are doing any work in your own backyard and you're clearing, make sure that you replant as soon as possible afterwards. We're going to give you some resources at the end of this spot so that you can learn more about invasive plants and find out how to keep your gardens and your backyard clear of native plants. Thanks so much, and now I'll pass it back to Brian.
Thank you, Sara. Joining me now is Lori Bachman, Executive Director of the Riverbend Environmental Education Center. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you, Brian. I'm so happy that you could be here and visit with us today.
Before we get started, I just wanted to say congratulations again on your award of the 2017 Go for the Green Lower Merion Township EAC Award for Education.
Yes, we're thrilled to receive that award. It means so much to all of us here at Riverbend, and we were particularly excited because it highlights our aquaponics education program.
Excellent. So, can you tell our audience a little bit about Riverbend, its mission, its history, maybe a little bit about their programs?
Sure. So Riverbend was founded in 1974, and so it is tied to this place on Spring Mill Road. It's a hidden little gem, as people like to say. We have 30 acres, and our purpose is to connect children to the natural world, teach them environmental principles, so that they'll grow up to care about the environment, have an awareness of environmental issues, and hopefully become good stewards of the environment as they're able to make decisions.
So you mentioned it's a gem. It truly is a gem. What makes it so special?
Because it is here, it is open to all the residents of Lower Merion Township. Every day of the year from dawn to dusk, we have native habitat for residents to come and enjoy, bring their families, bring their children, bring their dogs, and it's open to the public and free of charge, and we welcome visitors all the time.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about maybe your summer camp program or any of the other programs you wanted to highlight?
Yes, so we deliver our mission through education programs. Our summer camp program, which you mentioned, is very popular among the residents of Lower Merion Township. We have more than 600 children throughout the summer that come for 11 weeks of camp. And we also have year-round camp on school holidays, which is also a very popular option, especially for working parents. And we serve the most children really through our school programs, and those are field trips, and they're also off-site programs where we go into schools and bring our programming on the road. That's really where we serve the most children. Last year we served about 20,000 program visits to our school programs, and that's in the greater Philadelphia area. Also, we like to do family programs on weekends, and among them are our Shiverfest program that comes up in October every year, celebrating all good things around Halloween. And we also do a birding and bagels program, so come out with your kids or your adults. It's for everybody to come out. And we also just launched a new series of programs this year called Our Table, Our Planet, and those are dinners here at Riverbend, only for a small number of people, about 30 people max, and it's offers residents an opportunity to come and talk about how the environment in fact impacts food, and how growing food impacts the environment. So it's a great opportunity to talk about various elements affecting locally grown food and foraging and other topics like that.
So I understand people can camp here too. Is that true?
We do offer family camping a couple of times a year up on our hillside. You can't just come and camp. It's part of our program. So we do offer those programs. So you'd have to check our calendar to see when the next one is happening.
Thank you, Lori. When we come back, we'll discuss some of the great things Riverbend Environmental Education Center is doing to restore native species on their site. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Environmental Update. I'm Brian Hoppy, Chair of the Township's EAC. We're on location at the Riverbend Environmental Education Center. Joining me now is Aaron McCool, Riverbend's Director of Education and Strategic Initiatives, and Lorna Atkinson, Riverbend's Habitat Management Coordinator. Welcome, Aaron and Lorna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lorna, the first question's for you. I understand that for the last 10 years, you've undertaken a pretty aggressive native species planting effort. Why is it so important to remove and replace non-native species within our township?
Yeah, we have planted a lot of trees in the last few years. Riverbend used to be completely covered in invasive vines, and they formed like a really thick blanket that nothing could grow under it. They reach up into the trees, and when you have invasive vines, making a blanket covering like that, you have a situation where you just have one type of plant, you have a monoculture, and that's the exact opposite of the type of diverse native habitat that we wanted to have here at Riverbend. And we also had a problem with the white-tailed deer, the overpopulation of deer in this area, and the excessive browsing prevents the regeneration of natural forests. So we have the deer preventing regeneration, which leaves the forest open to invasive species, and this blanket covering, and we knew that we needed to address the deer problem before we could look at anything else with our woodland restoration. So our woodland restoration really began with the installation of the deer fence in 2009, I believe. And then once that was in place, that really allowed us to focus and begin to invest in planting native trees and shrubs. So since that time, we've planted almost 4,000 native trees and shrubs, which is a huge undertaking. And we didn't do it all at once. No one has unlimited resources for that kind of project. So it was a phased woodland restoration, and it was done largely with the support of a Tree Vitalize Watersheds grant, which is run through Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and with the support of a huge number of volunteers as well. So we began near our outdoor classroom area, and we took a section each year to kind of reclaim from these invasive vines and invasive plants. So we would clear the area and then plant the trees, and we slowly moved along the hillside, and now we're moving into other areas at the top of the preserve and things like that. But it doesn't just end with the planting of the trees. You can't just plant the trees and then kind of sit back and watch your lovely native habitat kind of flourish. It takes a lot of management. Most of what I do outside is going into these areas, checking for the resurgence of vines, working with volunteers to keep the vines from growing up the trees and give the trees a chance to reach maturity. And we mostly do that with hand pulling and just constant vigilance. At this point, complete eradication of an invasive species is probably not a realistic goal, so we just work really hard to manage the invasive species and keep them from coming back to dominate. And the reason we do that, and the reason why we feel it's so important, is partly for the children and the visitors who come to Riverbend. We want them to be able to experience a vibrant habitat with a lot of life. Most native plants aren't of great value for insects, so you not only have a lower diversity of plant life, but of insects and then birds and animals and things like that. So we really just want to create as healthy a native habitat as possible for our visitors, but also just as part of the local ecosystem and part of the township, because everything is joined together. And we hope when people come to visit Riverbend, they'll see what we're doing, and then when they're out in local trails, local parks, they'll be able to recognize invasive species, and we can all kind of continue to work to combat it and preserve our native landscapes and plants.
Excellent. So you mentioned thousands of trees and shrubs that you planted, and I'm thinking about our residents and what they can do on their own properties. Can you just list off a couple of example native trees and shrubs that are used here in Riverbend and something that a resident could purchase and plant on their own property?
Yeah, we have, I really like the red maple. Is a really lovely tree, and it has lots of nice autumn color. Shrubs that we plant, I love the redbud, which is kind of like a small tree. I think that's one of my favorite trees, especially kind of early spring. It's the first color that you see, and you can see like a haze of purple through the woodlands, and they're lovely by themselves as a specimen in somebody's front yard, as well as in a woodland setting like this. So the redbud tree is a really great one.
So I understand that you've established a new American chestnut grove. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting project. The American chestnut tree used to be a really common, important tree up and down the East Coast. I think in forests, 1 in every 4 trees was an American chestnut. And then in the early 1900s, the chestnut blight arrived, and the American chestnut started to succumb to this disease. So the chestnut blight is an Asian fungus, and our native trees didn't have the resistance to it. And I think it was first spotted in 1904 in New York, and by 1950, around 4 billion chestnut trees had been destroyed, killed by this fungus, which was almost every mature specimen of the tree. And so the American Chestnut Foundation is working to restore the American chestnut to our landscape and to our eastern forests. And they are doing this through a breeding program with American chestnuts and Chinese chestnuts. And they use a process called backcross breeding, where they'll breed the two types of tree together, select an offspring or a progeny which has characteristics and look of an American chestnut, but the disease, the blight resistance of a Chinese chestnut. And that's been going on for years. And then what we have here that we've planted in our chestnut grove is a tree which is 15/16 American chestnut and 1/16 Chinese chestnut, so it will look like an American chestnut and hopefully just be resistant to this blight. And we planted the chestnut grove in a really lovely location at the top of a hill and near a pond. And I believe it was made possible with donation by a local man named Leonard Keating. And it's such a great project to be involved with. We planted these hybrid chestnuts and we planted some pure American chestnuts as well. And I think it's just really interesting for visitors to read about it, learn about the science of it, and the volunteers who come and work on the area as well. It feels like just such a forward-looking project and a really hopeful project. So I really love that Riverbend was able to be a part of the work the American Chestnut Association is doing.
So it's up by the pond?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that pond. My daughter, when she was 4, fell in that pond. Yeah. So anyway, speaking of water,
yes,
let's turn to you, Erin. I understand that you've established a aquaponics greenhouse. Can you tell us how that fits within your mission?
Yes, absolutely. We are so excited about the greenhouse. This is an opportunity for us as an environmental education organization to look at a project that both has a conservation impact and also educational impact. So aquaponics is a sustainable way to produce food. We can actually use fish to fertilize plants and grow food in almost a closed ecosystem that uses 90% less water than traditional farming and far less energy. So we can really reduce our carbon footprint in the production of food. The great thing about aquaponics, though, is not only is it sustainable for growing food, it's also a really exciting teaching tool. So we've been able to create a program that actually goes into classrooms where students have aquaponics in their classroom all year. They have a curriculum. Our educators go out and work with them to install the systems and help really turn their classrooms into STEM labs and really transform the way that they're learning about STEM and the environment. And this is a really important tool as students are going to be facing a changing earth. We're really getting them prepared now to think critically, to solve problems, and to use science to really transform the world.
You mentioned STEM. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. And so this is a buzzword for sure now, but it's something that schools are very focused on. As we said, the earth is changing and students are really going to need to be prepared to use science to solve some of the problems. And when you look at something like aquaponics, we're able to use engineering to build a system that mimics things like soil and nutrients in soil in an artificial setting, so we can have a high production of plant growth, but then also produce less waste.
That's great. Well, Erin, Lorna, thank you for joining me here today, and thank you for all the great things that you're doing here at Riverbend and teaching us a little bit how we can implement some of that within our township. I'm Brian Hoppy, Chair of the Lower Merion EAC. Thank you for joining us for the summer edition of the Environmental Update. If you have any suggested topics for future episodes or have a question on an environmental issue, please email us at the address below. Thank you, and we'll see you again in the fall.